Hey folks, so this video attempts to explain in a clear and concise way what is callback help, what are promises, and what is async and sync functions. So you can see here callback help is multiple asynchronous operations, each dependent on the previous one. And what I have written here is kind of clearly concise code that you can copy yourself and kind of walk through and try to understand how callback help comes about. And essentially, in here we have function 1, and function 2 depends on the output of function 1, which it does. It simply concatenates the string. It could do anything. And function 3, which depends on the output of function 2. And this is the code that years ago you would have had to have written. So first of all, you call function 1, pass it a message. That's your input, and the callback function, which is all this. And this is where it gets confusing, because the callback function is not just one function, it's a series of nested callbacks. And so you have function 1, message, and then the callback. And then once that's complete, the function itself needs to call the callback function, which is all this. And then it goes to the next function, and so on and so on. And you can see it's pretty confusing. It's even hard for me to explain it. But that's the whole point of promises. So the whole point of promises was to get rid of this kind of callback hell pyramid and instead make a more clear and concise way of writing code. It doesn't do anything different. It just is easier to read and write. And so promises at its core is just simply a interface. And here we create a new interface promise called P. And you would normally do this in a program. This is just an example to show how the then and the catch work. You basically create a promise. You pass it through the then function, which is kind of hidden. It gets exposed when you create a promise. And so that's the callback function that goes into the resolve parameter. And when I type .catch in another callback function, it goes into the reject parameter. And inside the promise itself, you have some logic that says if something is true, resolve. So it'll execute this. If something is false, I mean, if the logic ends up leading to the reject callback, it will just run the .catch program or .catch callback. And so you can see. Actually, first of all, I'll jump back to this callback hello one and execute it just so you can see that one. So executing it, you get callback function 1, 2, and 3 printed out in the console log, and at the end you get the entire. Sorry to jump back on you, but at the end you get the entire concatenated string printed out inside of function 3, so you kind of know that the data is being passed, and then also put this end here to show you that this function is not actually asynchronous. This is being executed in a sequence and not being not asynchronous. And it's not an asynchronous series of functions. So sorry to jump back, but so if I execute this, I got to comment out some stuff down here. Let me just comment out the rest of this, and I'll just execute this, and you can see this. Oh, I get put a star there. Try that. So you can see if inside the promise the logic leads to the reject, then it executes the reject callback. This is not super useful. I just put it in here because it just kind of shows that inside the promise there's some logic that leads you either to resolve or reject. I'm going to comment this out, and we'll go into an actual usable series of promise functions. So here you can see sequential promises that pass data to each other. And just a note as well that promise functions are handed off to the message loop or micro loop or whatever Node.js is using to manage these series of callbacks. Unlike callback hell, where everything's at least in my example, executed sequentially. In here, I'll just run it, and you can see they're not being executed sequentially because P promise function 1 is being executed first, and then the console log end statement is being done, and then it goes back to the queue and does 2 and 3, and then finally it's finished. So asynchronous, yes, but keep in mind that if you have heavy code in each one, it still takes time in the main queue. It still takes time to execute. So here's more practical example where you're actually using functions to and promises together, and essentially each function takes a string and concatenates the string each time and returns it. So it doesn't have, and it doesn't return it. It calls the resolve callback. These ones don't have if true or false, so the reject will never get called. But if you were to put in here, call the reject function, it would instead call the catch. It would instead go to the catch callback. So thinking back on callback hell, instead of having to write a pyramid of callbacks, nested callbacks, now you can simply write pf1 start. So you pass it its first argument, and you write .then, and the callback that you want it to run after it's complete. And you end up with this nested, not a nested loop, but a series of then statements and a catch, and that is a lot easier to read compared to this. So that is essentially promises, and like I said again, best thing to do, copy this code out, walk through it, and you'll understand that part about promises. And next, the latest and greatest way of writing a series of callbacks is to use sync and async. And here, in this example again, same functions, sequential promises that pass data down the chain. But now, the whole point of async and await, async and await, is that instead of even instead of having to write this, which can be a little also confusing, now you can write code that looks like normal sequential code. You just go message await pf1. This try block won't continue to the next function until this one's finished. And at the same time, it's asynchronous because this end will get called in around here somewhere. So let's just give it a run. Same result. So you can see it's still asynchronous, which is what we want. And it's still a series of functions that depend on the previous function, but it's much easier to read. And again, you can copy this code and follow yourself how these functions and messages are being passed into functions that have promises in them to understand the sequence of operation there. And that is it. Thank you.